what's up you guys? It's Simon. Welcome back to my channel. So before we get too deep into this week's video, this Thursday's video, I just wanted to give sort of like a little sneak peek as to what this video was supposed to be. I realized recently that all my videos are filming in 740p and not 1080 or even 4K. 1080 would be fine, but 740 is not, and so I had to switch to filming with my back camera, and because of that, somehow during the process, I lost literally like 90% of the footage for this. So this was obviously, like I said in Monday's video, supposed to be a redraw of my first ever Instagram post, which is this. You can see right here. Let me see if I can zoom-a-rooney in on that for you guys. Hopefully that is in focus. But yeah, I drew this about 3 years ago in 2017, and it was the whole entire reason I started my Instagram. So if you don't know anything about, like, you know, me and my Instagram and how I started sharing my art online, basically the story is I was laying in bed and I was kind of half asleep, and I heard the song Thunder by Imagine Dragons for the first time, and I thought that instead of saying thunder, they were saying fun dip, and I got an idea for this illustration, and I thought it was going to be really, really cute and cool and an interesting enough idea to put on Instagram. So that is why I made my art Instagram, and I've been posting there ever since for the last 3 years. So if you haven't seen my art on Instagram, definitely go check it out. It's obviously the same name as it is here, at Simon AES Arts, and I post on there every other day. So if you want to see more of my art besides just YouTube, that would definitely be the place to go. But here is the redraw. It's not done yet. I still have to add the yellow background, but obviously I lost the footage for this, but I still wanted to talk about it because it is something that is obviously very special and important to me. But anyway, let's get into the actual topic of this week's video, which is a Copic tutorial. So let's get into that. Okay, so normally when I'm working with Copics, the first thing I would do obviously is get a sketch, or occasionally I'll do some type of thing with, like, I'll print out like my line art that I worked on from Procreate. Sorry, I'm just making sure you guys are in focus. Like I said, back camera issues. Okay, anyway, so normally I obviously get my sketch going, or sometimes I'll sketch directly on paper, but for this video I decided to make things as fast and easy as possible, so I have very lightly printed out a sketch that I did in Procreate to sort of simulate as if I were sketching on paper, just so that we could get the sketch process out of the way. And then the very next thing I do is what I guess counts as line art, but for me it doesn't really count as line art because it doesn't really require any super fine not motor skills, but, like, you know, line art skills. You know, you do one smooth solid line. You don't have to do that because I line with pencils. So what I do is I just follow the lines of my sketch. I try to sketch as cleanly as possible, and I always sketch if I'm sketching directly onto the paper, or even if I'm not sketching directly onto the paper, with a red pencil like this. The barrel doesn't have to be red. It can be whatever color you want as long as your lead is red. Preferably, it's not the Pilot color, you know, despite the packaging. It is actually a Papermate lead that I love very much. I actually have some red Pilot red, oh my gosh, some Pilot, no, it's Pentel. Oh, okay, so this is Pentel red lead, and I don't like it. I've talked about it in another video before. It is pinker than the Papermate one, and it also does not erase very well. If you want to see a video talking about how this erases, I think I talked about it a little bit in my Sketch With Me, or perhaps my sketchbook tour. I don't know. I know I've talked about it in a video before, but yeah, so this erases really well, but it's also very hard to find. I personally found it at a Walmart, and then it stopped being there, so now I can only find it online. So if you ever see, it's like a 3-pack of Papermate lead. It's a green, red, and blue set of lead, and I would strongly encourage you to go and pick some of it up because it's really good. But anyway, so I'll sketch in red because when I go in with Copics later, not only does it sort of melt away, but what does not go away gets blended out and sort of looks like it naturally, you know, blends into the skin. It's just some natural, you know, red undertones. But because obviously we're working with a very clean digital sketch, we don't have to worry about erasing and cleaning things up, but if you do sketch directly onto your paper, make sure that you've cleaned it up. So the next thing I do is I get my pencil and I get it real sharp. So some pencils that I really like for doing line art, I'm pretty fond of the Prismacolor Very Thin pencils. These watercolor pencils that I still don't know what brand these are. I bought them at Walmart and have never seen them again. That seems to be the trend for things that I like at Walmart. They just disappear. But yeah, so there's this, and then also Crayola pencils. I love them. They're super cheap, obviously. They're made for kids, but they are great for line art, and I would, again, strongly encourage you to get some. So then obviously the next thing I do once my pencil is all sharpened is I will pick a color that's sort of similar to the tone of, or the base tone of what I'm gonna do. So this is gonna be like kind of a pale to mid-tone skin tone, but really for like 90% of skin tones, unless I feel like using like a burnt orange, I'll just use a regular brown. Her hair, on the other hand, is going to be orange, so I got a sort of like reddish, darkish orange, but you basically just want to get a color that's going to be dark enough that it won't, you know, be lost when you do your darkest tones, or if you feel like you want to completely blend out your line art, you can do that. Just pick a color that you think would suit your line art best. It's kind of like if you're doing digital work and you finish all your line art, you do it black, then you color everything, and then you do an alpha lock and sort of just soften the line art with different colors. That's essentially the point here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to speed this up and draw along these lines. Okay, so now that you have your line art all finished, the next thing you're going to want to worry about, obviously, is choosing your colors. And the most important thing to have, regardless of brand, I don't care if it's Ohuhu, I don't care if it's Copic, I don't care if it's Touch New, Sketch, it's not Sketch Noir, something Noir. I don't care what brand of marker that you have. Regardless of brand, you need to have a swatch chart. So this is a swatch chart. You might have seen this in my videos before, and this is just a swatch of every single Copic marker that I have that lets me know, you know, what sort of colors my markers actually look like when they're on the paper that I'm using, because much like the cake in Portal, the cap is a lie. Some of them might be very close, but the best thing that you're going to want to do, especially if you're using a new paper or you are not familiar with the markers that you're using, you want to have a swatch so that you can look at the marker, you can look on here and say, oh, so I want her to have orange hair, so I want to look through my swatches and see like, oh, what are some like natural orangish tones? Because if I was just looking through my markers, I would see this and think, you know, maybe that's like a light sort of ginger, but as we can see, YRO2 is a light ginger, but it's also very peach. It's not necessarily the tone that I want to go for. Or for example, this YR18 that we are going to use looks like a nice burnt orange, if it will focus. Focus, please focus. Good enough. So it looks like a nice burnt orange, but as we see on the swatch, it is actually a little bit darker. It looks real close on camera, but it's actually a little closer to like darkish brown in person. So obviously you want to have your swatch chart so you can see what markers actually look like. The next important thing is to pay attention to your blending groups. So first thing I want to say is you do not have to stick to the colors that are right next to each other. I do, just because my first set of Copics I ever got were, I think it was like a 6-pack of like skin tones, and it had like a couple darker shades and a couple lighter shades, and they were all right next to each other in blending groups. So I just got used to using those colors to do my skin tones and stuff like that, and generally with blending groups, they are, you know, pretty much a natural gradation into, you know, light to dark. And Obviously that's going to get you like the most natural blending. It's going to make things really easy for you. But if you want to go a little outside of your comfort zone, or if your comfort zone is sticking outside of like natural gradients, like say you want to do like a peach skin tone like this, and you want to blend, because sometimes blending groups, you have these lighter colors, but then you have colors like EO4 that stick out like a sore thumb and don't really have like a blend that they go with per se. So let's say you do want to use EO4, even though they're right next to each other. EO4 is obviously significantly different from EO2, and you can do that. You're totally allowed to do that. Let's say you really like this BG23 color, but you also like this RV23 and you want to mix them together. Do that. It's up to you. But if you want to do, again, like sort of like a natural gradient, it's best to pay attention to your blending groups. So what you really want to do is you want to pick about, like, say 3 or 4, maybe even 5 if you're feeling kind of like you want to do some really intense blending colors in a color group. So for my skin tone, for lighter tones, sometimes I go with E000, but I wanted to doubly make sure that you guys could see on camera because E000 is very light. I just picked these 4. They're obviously, like I said, all in a row on the blending chart. They're all right next to each other so that it makes it super easy for me to blend these colors. I personally like to go about 3 to 4 just because since I do choose between blending groups, it makes it so that the gradient between each color isn't always the most noticeable. So sometimes you need a shock, like with E15, that's going to make things just dark enough to understand, like, hey, this is a shadow. So yeah, always pick like 3 or 4 colors, at least 3 I would strongly recommend. You can do it with 2, but 3 is just, you know, my go-to because it makes blending look a lot smoother. If you're going for something a little more stylized, maybe with like cell shading and stuff like that, then that doesn't matter as much. You can go with like 2 colors. But if you're really trying to use alcohol markers for their purpose of, you know, you're blending, a lot of blending, then I would definitely recommend picking at least 3 or 4 colors. So yes, let us get into the actual coloring. This is where things get pretty dang easy. The very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my lightest color. With Copics, sometimes you can work dark to light. I'm going to show you how to do that when we do with the hair. But usually for things like the face, it's best to go light to dark because you're going to be really struggling to get those light tones back in if you don't start there. So definitely start from light to dark. Sometimes I'll blend with like a triangle underneath the eyes with my very, very lightest color, maybe around the forehead and stuff like that. But today, to make things, you know, simpler, I'm just going to cover the entire thing with my base tone. So I go with the smaller areas first because alcohol markers do dry up. So by dry up, I mean like when you put them on the paper, they're wet and then they dry. And so if you go over a spot that's already dry, you are then layering that color and it's gonna make it darker than it was beforehand, which is another plus for alcohol markers. You don't have to buy as many colors because you can layer them, but also it's not great when you're covering a large area and it's supposed to be, you know, like smooth like a skin tone, and then it's kind of patchy because you decided to wait too long while it dried. My biggest thing, I always use the chisel nib to fill in most of my base colors. I'm not going to be doing it for the hair because we're going to be using a different technique, but if you know you have a color that's going to be going almost entirely all over a certain area, you're going to want to cover that with the chisel nib as quickly as possible because it is broader and it will, you know, get into the small areas. It looks intimidating at first, but once you get used to using it, it's really not that bad. I also would recommend looking into a paper that is meant for markers. I personally use mixed media paper just because I tend to incorporate obviously a bunch of other mediums like watercolor and acrylic and all other sorts of things into my illustrations. So I really need a mixed media sketchbook as my primary sketchbook because I use so many different things. But if you're somebody that uses just, you know, exclusively like alcohol markers and you're not looking to experiment with any other type of medium, I would recommend looking into something like a Bristol board or a render sketchbook, because those I've heard are very, very good for markers. I've heard that you can draw, you know, on both sides of a render sketchbook, so I really, really want one. But, you know, I, again, just personally go with the mixed media sketchbook because that is what works best for me. If you want to know what sketchbook I use, it is the Canson XL mixed media. I found mine at Walmart. They also sell them at Hobby Lobby and Michael's, but they sell them at Walmart for cheaper. So I'm just saying, it's the exact same sketchbook. If you see it in Walmart, snatch it up. Okay, so the next thing that I do is, it's something that's gonna move very, very quickly. So the next thing you do is you take your next darkest shade, and you wanna do this while this is still kind of wet, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. That's just the best way to do it. But again, don't fret if it dries. And then I just go with my next lightest shadow, and I go in all the places where I would deem shadow. Almost 90% of the time, regardless of my light source, I shade right underneath the nose, the corners of the lips, right underneath the neck, right under, or not under, right above the eyelids, and on the sides of the face. This is normally just for like base lighting, but obviously if you're working from a reference, take your light source into account. You know, it doesn't have to be like this every time, but this is, you know, my general sort of what I do when I shade for almost all of my illustrations, because I don't vary my light source very often. But if you're somebody that does, or if you're like sketching like a comic panel or something and you have a very specific light source in mind, do obviously, of course, follow your light source. I also will take the corners here, and I don't know how to describe this, but I will kind of make like a triangle-y shape, and I will like push it underneath the eye a little bit, and then I immediately take that base color and I will blend every single thing in until the edges, oh my gosh, the edges are very soft. And what I'm doing right now is this technique called feathering. You basically are just flicking your brush end of your marker and not really, you know, making like bold strokes or anything like that. You're just doing very light-handed sort of things. So the best thing with alcohol markers obviously is that they blend, and the best way to get a blend is to use the brush nib and use this feathering technique, because again, like I said, it makes the edges really, really soft. You can do it with a chisel nib, but it is much harder to do so because obviously the chisel nib is a little bit harder to control. But for, you know, basic blending, always go with the brush nib, unless of course you're blending a super huge area. But right now we're just doing little tiny areas. And another bonus about doing it when it is still wet is that it will dry a little bit blended on its own, just because, you know, it is like bleeding into each other. If you want to think about it like watercolor, how watercolor, when you put wet on wet, they just sort of naturally blend and fade into each other and create like a natural sort of gradient thing. So yeah, that is what I do for that. And then I just sort of darken up all of the areas that I think that there needs to be more shadow, or that I like needed shadow before. So I'm just sort of, you know, going into all of the places that I missed and darkening them up. And then this is my favorite part. I always do the nose. I will go underneath it, like right on the, whatever the underneath of the nose is called, and then I'll go on the bridge right here, and then I make a little circle. That's my favorite thing to do. I don't know why I started doing that, but that's what I do for all of my illustrations. Again, regardless of light source, that is how I blend it. And then yeah, so I have like my basic blending going on, and then I'll see places where I believe things need to be darker. So obviously I went over and added my extra shadows that I missed beforehand, but then there are some places where once I've added all of it, I feel like need to have a little bit of extra darkness. So I will take my next darkest color. For me, it's E13. It can be whatever you want as long as it's darker than the previous color. And then I'll go underneath of like where places I think need darker. So under the nose, I feel like should have a little bit more of a drastic shadow. In fact, maybe even a little bit up here. And these are also stuff that we're going to blend out in just a little bit. I don't think that these corners are darkening up enough for my liking, so I add them there. I almost always, you know, add a second darker shadow on the eyelids, under the nose, and right under the jaw, just because I don't know, that's kind of what I do every time. It's just, you know, my thing that I do. And then I will take that, again, second darkest color, and then also your base color, and blend those out. And you want to work quickly because, again, like I said, as it dries, the harder it is to blend those colors out once they've settled on there. So as soon as you put a color down, if you're intending to blend it out, do so near immediately, otherwise you're going to be stuck with that color there. Essentially, you can lift it if you try really hard, but there's going to be, you know, some nasty bleeding in areas that you definitely do not want. So there's that. I'm going to darken up the sides of the face just a little bit more because I don't feel like they are standing out enough for my particular liking, so I'm just going to darken up certain parts right there. And this feathering technique, I want you to keep this in mind because this is what we're going to be doing for the hair. If you guys have seen my digital paintings and stuff like that, you know that I try to go for like a somewhat semi-realistic style. I know it's still technically, obviously with the huge eyes, very cartoonish and stuff like that, but I do try to blend things at least somewhat according to life, so we will get into that in just a little bit. And then I like to add a pinkish color. So with lighter skin tones, obviously it's going to be a pink, but something I see a lot with digital paintings, especially with darker skin tones, you can't just put a pink on top of a dark skin tone. So what you need to do is either find like a much darker brown or even a dark reddish brown. So for example, if I was if my base tone was E25, I would not be using RV13 to blend the blush into the cheeks. I would instead probably go with something like E07 or even like an RV, or not RV, this is an R35, just something that's like a dark reddish brown that I can then blend in, you know, with my darker tones and stuff like that, my mid-tone, whatever you like to call it. But yeah, you don't want to use a pink tone, especially not with alcohol markers, because when you add lighter tones on top of darker tones, they bleed and they do this really, really weird feathering technique that is not the cutest thing. I'm sorry if you can hear my brother sniffling. But yeah, so it's not great. It does bleed a lot. And also if you're using a sketchbook that is not a render, it will bleed through very, very heavily onto the other page. So definitely, if you're using a darker skin tone, make sure that it's actually, your blush is equally as dark. You want to think of your blush more as a shade rather than like, you know, just pink. So yeah, I hope that made sense. But yeah, I see that a lot, and it's definitely not going to work great for alcohol markers. So again, just take your blush tone and then your base tone, or sometimes your mid tone, depending on how heavy you went on the shadow, and then just feather it on there as light as you possibly can, because again, you're going to want to blend this out so that it doesn't look very harsh. So I usually just put it on the cheeks, and then I'll go in with a color pencil later to deepen that if I feel like it didn't you know, appear blushy enough. But you don't want to go too ham with the actual blush colors, because they can be dangerous. Sometimes they don't be blending out, and then you have really weird streaks on your illustration, and then something that may have been really cute now looks kind of strange. So yeah, and then sometimes I'll use that blush tone as like to color the lips and things like that, as well as, if I'm feeling crazy, the tear duct, because of reasons. So yeah, there is the base tone for the face. So now the next thing we're going to get into is the hair. And when I mentioned the whole dark to light thing, this is why I was saying sometimes you can do it backwards. So I have only recently started doing this method for hair, and I love it. I told you guys like probably almost a year ago that I had no idea with Copic markers until I saw this one TikTok, and I cannot remember their name. I don't use their exact method, but basically I saw them going from dark to light first, and I was like, that is genius. I don't know how I never thought of that, because even in my digital painting, I would just go, you know, either mid-tone to light to dark, because you can go in whatever order you want when you're digital painting. So when I was doing Copics, I would start with my mid-tone and I'd realize, uh-oh, no highlight. Oops. And then I'd obviously add in my darker tone, but it would still look very flat. And I also just couldn't really figure out a way to like stylize how I colored it again until I saw this method. So similar to what I said in my hair tutorial, it's going to be pretty much the exact same color method, just with the order we illustrate the colors in a little bit differently. So you separate things into chunks. So obviously I can see that this itself is one big chunk. So I'm going to take my darkest color, which was YR18, and I put it up. Oopsies. Let me grab that. So I take my darkest tone, and then I do that feathering technique. And I try to keep in mind, again, my light source. So for me, if I'm doing something that's like a top down or like something from the side here, usually towards the middle of a chunk is gonna be where your highlight lies, or on the outside of the hair, stuff like that. So I just try to feather it, and you want to leave a lot of room on either side, or not on either side, like towards the highlight, because you're not just adding, again, just one other color. You're going to be coming in with multiple other colors. So here are, this is the basic sort of chunk thing that you do, and it looks kind of messy. But when you add the other colors, so this is YR18, I'm going to go in with YR16, you just kind of feather it some more, and you can see that it softens those edges so it doesn't look as, kind of crazy as it did before. And then I will take in my next lightest color, which for me is YR14. And then I sort of get a little bit chunkier with my lines. I don't feather it as much at the end. I'm still, making that feathering motion, but I'm not caring if it leaves, like, as you can see here, like a point at the tip. It can be a little bit of a chunky area. And then I'll take usually the chisel nib with this, and I will just kind of push some of those colors back and bring my highlight in. And it looks really dark right now, but it's gonna dry and be a lot lighter, because again, this is wet, so obviously it's darkening the paper, and it's gonna lighten as it dries. So yeah, I'll do that, and then sometimes I might need to go in, with the shadow again. I'm not gonna do that just yet, because I wanna see how that color lightens up, because I don't use it very often, so I don't really know what it's gonna do. But I'm just gonna, continue this technique and move on through the hair and see you guys for the eyes. So the next few things I'm gonna say are gonna be a little bit contradictory to what I've said before, but it'll make sense in a second. So that bleeding thing I was talking about with lighter colors on darker colors, if you make a mistake, something like this, you can push that color back. If you take that lighter color, just be sure you blend out the edges as well, so that you don't have a harsh like bleed line. But you can sort of fix places where you've gone out of line, or if you think that you can't do something like that, like it would maybe like mess up, but like if it happened on the face or something like that and you're really worried it would mess up your blending, just try and cover it up with something like I did over here, where although there wasn't blending, I thought it would be nicer to sort of try to bring in another strand of hair, and then to keep that from looking out of place, just take, oh, that's the wrong color. Just take your line art color again and sort of try and bring it back in so it looks like it was an intended part of the illustration. So that looks a little messy, but obviously if I were, you know, paying more attention, it would be a lot cleaner. Also, something I do want to say is this is a good example of why you need the swatch chart, because obviously I thought wire 12 was a lot lighter than it actually was. And I looked at the swatch chart and realized that if you, like, obviously it does look lighter, but this was done with the brush nib. And so if I go in with the chisel nib and I layer it, it gets too dark. So with the rest of it, I did just feather it out with this wire 12 so that it does look a lot lighter. If you do something like that, don't be too afraid. If you have this little thing called a colorless blender. So this is very dangerous. It is not actually a blender, believe it or not. If you add this on top of two colors, it's not going to magically blend them together. It's not like a Prismacolor pencil. It will just push the color away. So really, I feel like they should call it an ink eraser or something like that, because that's essentially what it does. You pop the little cap off and you can push away some of that ink. You don't want to go too ham again on this because it does lift considerably, and it also will spread a little bit. So like, say I want to get rid of this little orange here, I can push it and it will push that ink away. But if I go ham on this, it could spread more orange out, or it could spread, like you see the slightest bit, it is putting that invisible ink, I suppose, onto the edge. So yeah, just be careful with the colorless blender because it is not a blender. Again, it will just push your ink out of the way. So yeah, so there is the finished hair. So what I will sometimes do if I feel like it isn't dark enough, say I want her to have like a little bit more of a brownish tone rather than like a crazy red, I will just take a colored pencil and sort of add elements of that color into the hair, maybe in bits that I believe should be darker, like toward her roots or something like that. Or you can take the color that you used for line art. I'm using a soft pencil, which I kind of regret because it does this little weird texture, but I can blend that out with the marker here in a second. Just, you know, add some elements where you think that it should be darker. This is why I like to go with a mixed media paper, because I really like to just add some subtle elements of like other medias to maybe make the markers pop a little bit more. So obviously when I add marker on top of that, it blends away, but it also still has that nice shadow. You can also do this effect, of course, with markers if you have another darker tone that you maybe left out. But because this is one of my oranges, I don't have an orange that is darker than this, and I do have browns, but sometimes the browns and the oranges do not like to behave together, so it's better to just go with a colored pencil that I know I can blend out and soften and stuff like that. So yeah, there is the hair all finished. Sometimes I will take a gel pen and do like this kind of like flicky, like almost like anime highlight thing, but ever since I found this technique, I kind of stopped doing it. But if that's your thing, definitely go for it. It does look very cute. I did enjoy it for the short while that I was using it, but now again I do prefer this dark to light method because it does look a little bit more natural. So the hair, the eyes. This is also going to be a little bit contradictory to what I told you before, but we'll get that in just a second. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to be starting out. So like I was saying, so basically what you want to do is you want to go in with all of your colors, not all at once obviously, but you're going to start out with your mid-tone. So for me that is this E25, and I'm going to go over the entirety of the eye. And I'm just gonna fill this in and try to be as gentle as possible here, especially if you're working on a bit of a smaller scale, because alcohol ink does have a tendency to bleed slightly, regardless of the brand that you're using. So if you go really up close to your line art and you're also very heavy with your marker, it's going to push a little towards the edges. Also, if I put down my base color and I realize that it's making the line art look a little bit light, I just take my base color and I go over the base of the liner and just try to darken it a little bit. It's kind of hard to do if you don't have a steady hand. So like me right now, I'm hopped up on coffee because today was the pumpkin spice latte release. So it can be a little bit harder for me to get these colors darkened, and you can also go back over with your line art if you want to, but you know, for the sake of this tutorial, I'm just going to go over with the pencil, and especially on the eyebrows, this tends to happen a lot. What you can do is just take, again, the base color of your eyes, or if it's not a natural color like brown, you could do, like, for example, if the character has purple hair, you can go in with the darkest color of your purple or something like that, but I imagine she probably has naturally brown hair. So I go in with that, and then I take either one of my second shadows or my first shadows of the skin tone, and I will take that and blend out the edges of the eyebrows, just kind of bring it forward a little bit so it's still a little bit darker, but it's still also like a little bit blended. And sometimes I might go in with my base tone again, but for today I'm pretty happy with that, so that's what I'm gonna do. Next is for the white of the eyes. So this is kind of dependent on you know, what tones you want in your illustration. If you want really cool tones, you can go with a cool tone color. If you want something neutral, you can go with maybe like a gray, or like say if you're using Copics and you have something like E quad 0, any of the quads really will work. Really anything up to the double zeros, in my opinion, work really well. Or sneaky tones like this, like the R11, BG10, that are just like very, very pale. You essentially just want to pick a very light color and then decide, you know, the tone of your illustration. So for this, it's very warm toned, which obviously I could go with a warm toned shadow for the eye, but I actually want to do something that's going to contrast that a little bit, so I'm going to go in with one of my favorite colors to do white shadows, and that is BV31. It's pale lavender. I found this color through, I think it was Franard. It was like 2 years ago. I watched her do like my top 10 favorite Copic markers, and this was one of them, and I was like, I really love that color, so I'm going to get me some of that. But basically I take something like this, and this is when the colorless blender is again going to come really in handy, and I lost it, there it is. So what you're going to do is you're going to take this color, and because you're blending into white, obviously you don't have a white Copic marker, but you do have a colorless blender. So I take that color and I go in a round shape almost down to like half of the eye, and I will add in that shadow. And you can leave it like this, or you can do the decision that I usually tend to do, and that is blend the edges just the slightest bit with colorless blender, and that will soften that edge and it won't make it look as dramatic of a shadow. And then you're going to follow that shadow that you've made with your next darkest color. So for me, since I used E25 and I am one that likes to definitely follow the blending groups, the next color I'm going to go in with is E27, but I am actually going to go a little bit outside this shadow. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to follow the line that I've created, and then I'm going to flick just a little bit outside of that, and then I'm going to blend in again with my E25 and blur those edges. Sometimes I might push them back up, sometimes I might push them back down. It all is dependent on how I'm feeling that particular day, but for the most part, again, you just want to follow where that shadow is and then kind of stretch it out just the slightest bit. And you don't have to do this either. You can leave it just like this if that is what you want to do. But for me, I like to pull that down just a little bit because it, you know, with our eyes, you know, darker and lighter colors go all throughout it, and it beats having to go like little tiny little strokes. I hate doing that. So the next thing I'm gonna do is, I say it's contradictory because I told you not to take lighter colors on top of dark colors because it makes a weird bleed thing. That is not good for the skin, but like with the trying to blend out, you know, mistakes that you've made, that bleed effect can be really nice for if you're trying to render like something that's like a little bit more natural, like an eye where colors are not as solid. You know, you look at shadows and you can see in a lot of places that shadows have very crisp and clean lines, and you can see sort of where shadows start and where shadows end, but with your eyes, colors are just specked all throughout that dang thing. So I like to take this, and in the bottom corner I'm just gonna push ink back as much as I can, and it's gonna create this nice little bleed effect. And so similar to what I did with the colorless blender, you do want to be careful because again, there is a risk that your ink is bleeding. And actually this one's not lightening up the way that I want to, so I'm actually going to take this other lighter color and push it back even more, because again, I just want to get, there we go, I want to get that color pushed around. So yeah, you do want to be careful because again, you can push ink sort of into weird spots, and it is going to do like this. You see there's like a darker ring around it, but that's actually going to help us later because it's mostly going to be around where your pupil is, so that's actually going to get covered up for the most part, so you don't have to worry about it as much as if it were somewhere else around your illustration. Say again on the face, if you had that weird pushback, that would look very strange and not very nice or pretty. But with the eyes, since it's getting covered up, and also because it just looks, you know, more natural than if you were to start out with a lighter color, it doesn't matter as much. So now that we've got our highlight set in the eyes, I will take my darkest color and I will use usually like a very dark version of the base tone for the pupil. I don't really like to use black very often. This might look black, but it's actually a very dark brown. If you're wanting to follow along with my exact colors, this is E29. But yeah, so I just add a very, very dark color, and then what I'll do is I'll usually take a colored pencil, or again, if you want to go in with that E27 per se, you could go over the top with it, but I like to do this in pencil just because I like the added texture that it gives. And sometimes I'm basically, if it didn't get dark enough, you just want to sort of add that darkness back in. I usually also like to do this around the outer edges of the iris, even though, you know, in real life it is more of like almost like an airbrushed edge. I just like the idea. I think it makes the eyes pop a little bit more if you have a little bit of a darker edge to them. So the next thing that I do is my favorite part, and I think it's almost every artist's favorite part, and that is the highlights. So what I would 100% recommend you do is get Jelly Roll gel pens in 3 specific sizes. There is a pack at Walmart that has an 05, an 08, and a 10, and those are the best things ever. Let me get them out for you so that you guys can see exactly why I'm obsessed with these pens. So basically, here are the sizes. There is an average Jelly Roll, which is the 08 size, so you can see that it has, where are you guys? It has a relatively small tip. Let me see if I can get to you guys focused. Probably not. Yeah, it doesn't want to focus, but it's a relatively, you know, normal size tip. And then we have the 05, which is really, really good for smaller illustrations. There you guys are. The tip is a little bit smaller. It's kind of hard to tell. Let me show you guys in comparison to the 08, so you can see that it's just a little bit finer. So this is the 05 and this is the 08. I would show you guys the tip, but you guys are actually too far down for me to do that, and I'd poke you, and I don't want to poke you. So yeah, there are these two, and then this is a really, really good one, particularly for highlights in the eye, and that is the 10. So you can see that this is a big fat boy. It's really, really good for adding like solid, like circular big highlights, or if you're coloring something in white, for example. So if you guys remember my Parku marker review, her hair had clouds in it, and I used this number 10 Jelly Roll because it is just super, super pigmented, and I will show you guys just how pigmented. Let me pull you guys back so I don't bump into you. So let's give it a little focus, and then boom, it's just so satisfying. So one thing, if you're, you know, still kind of new to art and rendering things, something you want to keep in mind is, again, regardless of light source, your highlight is always going to be on the exact same size in the exact same side in the eye. You're not going to have one highlight here and one highlight here, because that's not how light works. It's reflecting on you from one place, even if you had like several sources of light. So if you had light from this side and from this side, you'd essentially have a highlight all the way across your eye rather than just having it one on this side and one on this side. It's not going to work like that. So your highlight is always going to be on one side. Something I also like to do if I put that highlight in and think, like I want to add a little bit more shine, I want it to be a little bit more sparkly, is I will take in either the 8 or the 5 depending on how big my illustration is. This one's relatively big enough, so I can probably go in with the 8, and I will add just like some little, being finicky. Sometimes they don't like to write because, again, it is a gel, so they will get like this, I guess it's like a film on top, but if you just write with it a little bit, similar to like any ballpoint pen ever, it will write again just fine. But yeah, so you just kind of flick it, and then I add these 2 little tiny strokes toward the center. I don't always do that, but again, sometimes I do. So this next trick I learned, I believe this is the wrong cap, but I believe was from a Sarah Tepes video, and it is essentially, you do like the little dot on the nose, which I always did before. I used to just do, wow, please write. I used to just do one little dot, but then she did this trick where she was like, if you stipple it sort of on the nose, it looks a little bit more like skin. So again, if you're not going for a semi-realistic style, if you're going like purely, you just want to make anime art, do the little dot, do whatever you want, but I personally, again, try to go for a little bit of semi-realism. So I like to add in that little texture, and I'll just kind of plop it in parts wherever I want, but I will initially start with that one big white line. And then I do one solid line along the tip of the nose bridge. Another good thing to keep in mind sort of when you're shading is to think about makeup. So if you know anything about contouring or something like that, or if you don't, watch a video on contouring, it'll help. Just try to think of like places on the face where you would put contour. So for me, I put shadow where I put nose contour, along the sides of the face, and not really along the cheekbones, just because I kind of like my characters to have a little bit of a rounder face. But if you want somebody to have chiseled cheekbones, put your shading here. Some people contour the inside of their, whatever these are called, the corners of the mouth, if there is a word for it, I don't know. Some people can contour there to make it look like they're smiling, even when they're not. But just stuff like that. You might contour, obviously your jaw, if you have a double chin like me, just stuff like that. Think about where you would put contour, and that's also where you'd put shadow. One thing I do that is different from that, though, is I've been doing this ever since I think I was in like middle school, and I discovered Lowish for the first time. Lowish adds highlights around the outside of the nose, and I have done that ever since I saw it for the very first time, and I'm obsessed with it. So the 5 is very finicky when it comes. So again, if you notice that it's causing you trouble and it doesn't want to write, just sort of scribble on something, but for the sake of time, I'm just gonna try to be gentle. I like to use the 5 for finer details like the sides of the nose, because sometimes my hand isn't very steady and I go over my line art and it's very annoying. But if I use the 5, it's obviously a much smaller area. I don't cover up as much, but you can use the 8 if you want to. Just keep a light hand sort of, and just keep it moving around the outer edges of the nose. Technically, in real life, that is where a shadow would be. But again, ever since I saw Lois do it, I just thought it was super cute. And now it's become, like, for me, I guess, a signature part of my style. I do it in every illustration. I cannot help myself to not do it. And if I forget it, I often will finish an illustration and be like, oops, I forgot it. And then I have to re-add it because I think it just looks strange without it. So yeah, I'll just add highlights around the outer edges of the nose, and sometimes, more often than not, lately I've been doing gloss, just because gloss is becoming a trend again. There were a few years, probably starting in like 2016, where everything was matte, and now everything from like the 80s and the 2000s and the 90s is coming back, so everything's very glossy. So yeah, I've been adding glossy lips to all of my illustrations, and also your lips are just naturally, not glossy, but they are naturally shiny. So even in an illustration that's meant to be more natural, you might add a slight sheen to the lips, because again, if you're licking your lips or if you're wearing chapstick or something, your lips are going to be a little bit shiny. So yeah, there is the finished illustration. I might add a few tweaks here and there, so always towards the end. A big thing about artists is that we don't know when to stop, so that's something to keep in mind, especially with something like alcohol markers, because you can just keep adding colors, and you kind of don't want to do that, because there might come a time when you add a color into a spot. So say the skin is definitely totally dry now, I can get away with sneaking in a little bit more of this E11 where I thought that the shadow kind of got not damaged, I don't know, it got blended in a weird way that made it look like it wasn't really shadowed or shaded anymore. So I can get away with sneaking that in, but sometimes you're gonna end up with super weird lines if you do it like that, especially when it's dry. So unless you're like really gently feathering, you might end up with a weird streak. So again, just try it, like, see, you can see around the eye if I don't blend this out, it's gonna look very weird. But if you are somebody who doesn't know when to stop, try and remind yourself to quit, because otherwise you might ruin an illustration that was perfectly fine before you added all of that extra stuff to it. But yeah, I just might sneak in a few last minute shadows where I think that throughout the process of just, you know, adding all of the other colors and things like that, it sort of got. So yeah, this is the final end result of the illustration. I hope you guys liked this video. I hope it wasn't too, you know, rambly or insane. I just wanted to try and fit as much information as I possibly could into this video, so I hope it was helpful. If there is anything that you're confused on, please leave a comment down below, or DM me on Instagram or Twitter or whatever you want. Just leave me a message somehow and I will try and clear things up for you. I also might, if I get a lot of like frequently asked questions or something, do like an updated sort of like less video but more like illustrated step-by-step. I don't know exactly how to describe it, but something like that on the community page or on Instagram, just to sort of clear things up that were potentially confusing. But yeah, I hope you guys liked this video. If you did, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think I could do better, or what you liked about this video, or I've been getting a lot of questions about tutorials lately, like face tutorials and anatomy tutorials and things like that. So if there's anything that you guys see that you think that I do well, I guess, and you want a tutorial, leave a comment of that down below and I will do my very best to do a tutorial. Obviously, I'm still doing my best to do them, but they're not the easiest thing, because again, it's still hard for me to talk and draw, but I'm doing my best. I do want to give a big shout out to my patrons, Elise Thompson and Duran. Thank you guys so much for continuing to support me every single month. If you want to get awesome things like shout outs alongside Elise and Duran, but also wallpapers and line art and you know, potential postcards and stickers in the future, and a lot of other cool stuff, as well as a discount to my Etsy shop, be sure to head on over to the Patreon. You can pledge for as little as $1 and get a ton of awesome stuff, so I would definitely recommend going to check that out if you can. But honestly, your support just watching these videos means enough to me, so thank you guys so much. I love you, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.